They said the photograph was taken on the happiest day of her life. A soft spring morning in 1874, in a quiet village on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The church bells rang faintly through the fog, and the young bride, Eleanor Whitmore, stood beneath an arch of pale flowers, her lace veil trembling in the breeze. The photo was captured on glass, one of those early, delicate portraits that took minutes to expose. Everyone held still. No one could move, no one could blink. It was the only image her family ever took of her alive. Days later, she was gone. Her heart stopped just before the wedding reception began. The photograph became a keepsake of grief, the last trace of a life cut short. But weeks later, something changed. Another photograph surfaced. The same room, the same people. Only now, she stood among them again. Her figure faint, almost transparent, eyes open but lifeless, her veil fluttering though no air moved. It wasn't a trick of light. The photographer swore he hadn't developed that image. The Whitmore family dismissed it at first. They thought it was an accident, some chemical mishap during development. But when they looked closer, her reflection appeared not only once, but twice, in two separate photographs, taken weeks apart. In one, she stood behind her mother, her pale hand resting on the woman's shoulder. In another, she appeared in the mirror behind the groom, her veil draped across his back like a shadow. The small village whispered about it, calling it the bride who wouldn't leave. Some claimed it was mourning so strong it tethered her spirit to the photographs. Others believed it was the devil's trick, using the sorrow of her family as a doorway. Whatever it was, one thing became clear. The more they developed new photos in that house, the more she appeared. Always faint, always smiling, and always looking directly into the camera. The photographer's name was Thomas Reddick, a quiet man who had worked with daguerreotypes and wet plate glass for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't easily frightened. He'd seen accidents in exposure, fading faces, ghostly blurs from long shutter times. But when he received the second Whitmore image, the one where Eleanor appeared faintly behind her mother, he felt something stir in his stomach. Not wonder, not curiosity, but unease. He checked his notes. Exposure time, 12 seconds. Natural light from the right window. For figures total. He developed the plate in his dim red-lit studio that night, hands trembling slightly. As the image appeared in the chemical bath, her shape came into view like a figure rising from deep water. First the outline of her veil, then the hollow of her face, then the faint curve of her lips. There was no doubt, it was Eleanor. The same gown, the same expression from her original wedding photo, down to the lace detail near her collarbone. Reddick couldn't explain it. The family hadn't brought the original plate back, and his equipment was meticulously cleaned after each use. No residual emulsion, no chemical overlap. Still, when he tried to recreate the image with a blank plate, faint streaks kept appearing, a blur in the corner, an outline of a woman's shape that vanished as soon as the light shifted. That night, he left the studio early, locking the door tight. But the next morning, when sunlight spilled through the dusty windows, something made him stop at the entrance. Hanging above his desk was the second photo of the Whitmore family. Only now, Eleanor's figure had moved. Her head turned slightly toward the camera, and her eyes were open wider than before. Reddick didn't remember it being that way when he'd sealed the print. He took a step back, feeling the stillness of the studio close in around him, and whispered to himself, "This isn't exposure, it's presence." News spread fast in small towns, especially in 1874 rural Pennsylvania, where gossip traveled quicker than mail. Within weeks of Eleanor's second photograph being revealed, whispers began to stir among the townsfolk. It started with the baker's wife, who claimed she saw the same veiled figure reflected in her storefront window just after dusk. Then a group of children, playing near the old Whitmore house, swore they saw a woman in white looking out from an upstairs window, even though the house had been locked since the funeral. The pastor called it imagination born from grief, but others weren't so sure. One evening, during a community gathering at the local church, the Reddick photograph was passed around under candlelight. Hands trembled as neighbors examined the ghostly outline, that unmistakable faint smile, her gaze directed just slightly left, towards something unseen. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, old Mr. Harlan, who had dug Eleanor's grave, muttered, "If she's in that picture." Then she didn't rest easy. Soon after, more photographs began to surface. A farmer's portrait, taken miles away, showed a pale figure standing near the barn door. Same height, same flowing dress. A family in the next county, who had purchased one of Reddick's old glass plates, developed an image that revealed a woman faintly visible between two children. Every instance traced back to that same chemical batch, the same month, the same eerie mistake. Reddick burned his equipment after that. He buried the ashes near the river and left town under the cover of night, saying nothing to anyone. But the villagers kept the photographs. They passed them down through generations, whispering about the bride who refused to fade. By 1900, those who still lived near the Whitmore property said that, on certain nights when the fog rolled heavy across the fields, you could still see the faint flicker of a white dress moving through the window, and the soft reflection of eyes that never truly closed. Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's husband, was never the same after her death, or after that second photograph appeared. Once a sturdy man of calm demeanor and steady hands, he became withdrawn, speaking less and drinking more. His neighbors said he spent nights in the parlor staring at the framed photo of their wedding, whispering to it, as if she might respond. But it was the new photograph, the one she wasn't supposed to be in, that consumed him. He kept it hidden in a small wooden box lined with black cloth, taking it out only at night. He claimed that sometimes, under lamplight, her expression changed. Some nights, she seemed to smile sadly at him. Other times, her eyes appeared darker, as though pleading for something he couldn't give. One night, the local undertaker found Thomas sitting by her grave in the rain, the photograph pressed against the headstone. He said Thomas whispered, "She knows what I did." No one understood what that meant. The next morning, the townsfolk found the door of his home ajar and muddy footprints trailing from the threshold to the cellar stairs. Inside the cellar, everything was still, except for a faint smell of formaldehyde and the presence of old photography tools, neatly arranged on a workbench. On one wall hung dozens of faded images of Eleanor, smiling, turning, blurred, reaching. They weren't wedding photos. They were new, taken after her death. Each one revealed subtle differences. Her hands slightly raised, her eyes more open, her lips parting as if to speak. Thomas had continued photographing her corpse, desperate to capture her true spirit, claiming he could preserve her soul in film. But the last photograph in the sequence, hidden beneath the others, showed something far more disturbing. The perspective had shifted. Eleanor's head turned toward the camera, her eyes wide open, staring directly at whoever took the picture. On the back, written in shaky ink, were the words, "She moved." That was the last anyone ever saw of Thomas. His boots were found at the riverbank days later, but not his body. Locals say that when fog covers the water, you can still hear a shutter click echo across the current. By the time autumn settled over the valley, the Whitmore estate was sealed and silent. The townspeople refused to enter it, not even to collect the furniture that could have been sold. Rumors spread faster than frost. Some said they'd seen a pale figure in a white dress at the upstairs window. Others claimed to hear faint music from the parlor, the same tune played at the wedding months before. The local priest, Father Hargreaves, decided to have the house cleansed and the cellar sealed, fearing that the late-night whispers might draw unwanted spirits. When he descended the cellar steps, he found the photographs scattered on the floor as though someone had rifled through them in a hurry. Most were stained, warped by moisture. But when he held them up to the lantern, he saw Eleanor's face, not still and peaceful, but increasingly lifelike from frame to frame. Her eyes seemed to follow him. The priest ordered the negatives burned. He claimed he did it himself, one by one, until only ash remained. Yet that same night, when he returned to his rectory, one photograph lay neatly on his pillow. It was of Eleanor, and this time, she was standing outside his church door. For decades, the Whitmore legend lived on as nothing more than a hushed fireside tale. The house eventually collapsed into ruin, its frame overtaken by ivy and silence. But in 1936, long after those who'd known the couple were gone, a historian cataloging rural Kansas estates stumbled upon a sealed envelope at the county archive. Inside were a dozen photographic plates, mislabeled with the words Whitmore, 1874. When developed, they revealed all the familiar poses of the doomed bride, but with details no one had described before. In the final image, Eleanor appeared older, impossibly older, her face bearing the marks of time she should never have lived to see. The historian dismissed it as a double exposure, a chemical trick of the old silver nitrate process. Yet something about her eyes unsettled him. They were not the dull gray of an old photo but a faint, reflective gleam, as if the light still lived behind them. He sent a copy to a photography journal, which printed it with the caption, "Unknown effect of residual light." The issue never reached distribution. The editor died suddenly before its release, and the original plates vanished again. In 1987, over a century after Eleanor Whitmore's death, the photograph surfaced once more, this time at an estate auction in Topeka. It was listed simply as antique glass negative, bride, unknown origin. The buyer, a photography restorer named Alan Crow, purchased it for $8. He had no idea he was holding one of the most whispered relics of Kansas folklore. Alan specialized in repairing corroded glass plates from the 19th century. He described the image as unusually clear for its age, yet unnerving. The bride stood beneath a window, her veil sheer and floating, her eyes reflecting an impossible sharpness. When Alan scanned the image, the digital display flickered, his computer froze, then rebooted itself. On screen, the photo now contained faint motion blur, as if the bride had shifted between frames. Thinking it was an artifact of the scanning process, he tried again. The second scan showed the same. Only now, she seemed closer to the lens. Alan laughed it off, calling it a coincidence of exposure. But when he checked the file's timestamp, he noticed something strange. The digital image was labeled October 22nd, 1874, the date of Eleanor's wedding and death. Over the next few nights, Alan's studio grew uneasy. He worked late, restoring tintypes, yet he kept glancing at the monitor where the image rested. Sometimes, the brightness of the screen dipped for no reason, as though someone had walked behind him. One night, while he was making notes on the plate's chemical deterioration, the lights in his workshop flickered violently. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs synchronized with the faint rhythm of what sounded like breathing. Startled, Alan unplugged every device, yet the sound persisted, emanating softly from his scanner. Inside it, the negative was still resting. When he dared to look, he noticed that a hairline crack had appeared across the glass, one that hadn't been there earlier. It cut through Eleanor's neck. Alan boxed the negative in panic and locked it in his safe. But when he returned the next morning, the box was empty. The scanner, however, had been turned on again. On the screen was a new file. The image showed his own reflection, faintly superimposed over Eleanor's veil, as if they had shared the frame. Alan couldn't sleep that night. The empty box haunted him, not because of what was missing, but because he had no memory of unlocking the safe. He replayed the day in his head, scanning, locking up, leaving. Nothing made sense. He started researching the photograph online, running keywords like 1874 bride photograph Kansas, and stumbled upon a decades-old article archived from the Leavenworth Herald. It detailed the unexplained death of Eleanor Whitmore, who was believed to have perished shortly before her wedding, yet whose likeness appeared in a photo dated the following week. Alan froze. The description of her veil, her posture, her eyes, all matched his glass negative. He contacted a local historian who had written about 19th century spirit photography, and she agreed to meet him. When she arrived at his studio, she took one look at the printed image and went pale. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "But that's impossible." The plate was said to have been destroyed in a house fire in 1893. Alan asked what she meant. The historian hesitated, then explained that this photo wasn't the only one. A second photograph had surfaced years later, showing the same bride, standing among her mourners. Alan's rational mind struggled to process what she was saying. You mean someone faked a second image? He asked. No, she replied quietly. It was taken by the same photographer, after her burial. The name she gave him made his blood run cold. Thomas W. Greaves. Alan looked back at the original plate. The photographer's embossed initials, TWG, were etched faintly in the corner. The historian continued, explaining that Greaves had been known in rural Kansas for his memorial portraits, a practice where grieving families posed their dead as if alive. But Eleanor's case was different. Greaves' ledger had contained two separate entries for the same woman, one dated a week before her death, one dated after. Alan realized he was holding evidence of both. That night, curiosity overpowered his fear. He opened his scanner again, determined to analyze the metadata of the ghostly image that had appeared on his screen. Yet as soon as the scanner light passed over the plate, a soft whisper escaped from the machine. Not static, not mechanical hum, but something faintly human. Do you remember me? Alan jolted back, his chair crashing to the floor. The whisper seemed to echo inside the room, not through the speakers, but in the air itself. For a long moment, he sat frozen, staring at the glowing scan on his monitor. The bride's face, Eleanor's face, was changing. He blinked rapidly, thinking it was just an afterimage from the scanner's beam. But no, her head had subtly tilted toward him. Her mouth was no longer closed. Alan zoomed in, heart pounding, as the pixels revealed the faintest parting of lips, the start of a word. He turned off the lights, expecting the illusion to vanish in darkness. Instead, the faint outline of the bride shimmered on the glass plate itself, as though lit from within. He didn't dare touch it. When the historian called later that night to check in, Alan hesitated but confessed what he'd seen. She went silent for nearly a minute before whispering, "If the image moved, then the second photograph has already found you." Alan didn't understand, but she insisted they meet again, this time at the old Greaves studio ruins, just outside Topeka. By morning, the rational part of his brain had returned. He packed his camera, a recorder, and the glass plate into a protective case. The drive to the outskirts was long and lonely, the landscape frozen in that timeless Kansas stillness, skeletal trees, rusted fences, and distant barns that hadn't seen life in decades. When he reached the ruins, the historian was already there, brushing dirt from an old foundation stone marked G 1872. She explained that this was the last known site where Greaves had photographed the Whitmore family, and local accounts claimed strange figures often appeared in pictures taken nearby. Alan humored her, setting up his digital camera to take some comparison shots of the area. The first few photos were normal, but when he reviewed the fifth image, his blood ran cold. In the distance, behind a collapsed wall, stood a faint, veiled silhouette, perfectly still, facing the lens. The historian hadn't seen her. Alan looked up from the camera and saw nothing there. But when he turned back to the screen, the figure had moved closer, one frame later, just inches from where he stood. The historian's hands trembled as she flipped through Alan's camera, staring at the progression of frames. This isn't possible," she whispered. The figure had drawn closer with each photo, as if advancing between moments of shutter-click silence. Alan tried to convince himself it was a reflection, a trick of light, but when he aimed his camera again, the screen flickered before turning black. The battery had drained completely, brand new moments ago. The air grew cold, sharp enough to sting their lungs. From somewhere behind the ruins came the faint, rhythmic sound of something brushing against the ground, like fabric dragging through dirt. Alan turned, flashlight shaking in his grip. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing fragments of an old wall covered in water stains that resembled faces, countless, overlapping faces, fading into each other. The historian clutched her notebook and said softly, "Greaves died here. They found him with his camera still clicking. No film inside." Her voice broke, and Alan realized she hadn't brought him here for research. She'd brought him to witness it, to prove that Eleanor Whitmore was still searching for the moment she was meant to rest. A sudden gust tore through the ruins, scattering dust and debris into a swirling cloud that seemed alive. Alan stumbled back as a whisper threaded through the wind, barely audible but unmistakably feminine. "Take it again," the historian gasped, clutching her chest. When the air settled, Alan's camera, which had been dead seconds ago, flashed and clicked on its own. A bright burst of light illuminated the interior of the ruins for a heartbeat, long enough for him to see something standing beside the historian. A translucent shape in a tattered bridal veil. Alan froze, unable to breathe. The historian slowly turned her head, but before she could scream, the figure vanished. The camera clicked one final time, then powered down again. They stood in silence, the air thick with dread. Alan checked the last image, the historian's terrified face, the faint outline of a woman behind her, and in the corner, something written in the dust, "I'm not gone." That night, Alan couldn't bring himself to sleep. The hotel room in the small rural town was silent except for the slow ticking of the clock and the occasional hum of wind against the window. His camera sat on the desk, turned off, its lens cap still missing. He hadn't dared to look at the photos again since they'd left the ruins. But curiosity gnawed at him. Around 2 a.m., he finally reached for the camera, scrolling through each frame with trembling fingers. The same images appeared, the ruins, the historian, the strange lights, until he reached the end. There was one new photo. It hadn't been there before. It was of his hotel room. His heart pounded as he zoomed in, the reflection of the mirror barely visible in the corner. In that reflection stood a woman in a bridal dress, her face blurred but her outline unmistakable. He dropped the camera, backing away from the desk, eyes fixed on the mirror. It was empty. The room was exactly as it had been, yet the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Alan whispered her name under his breath, Eleanor Whitmore, and the lights flickered once, dimmed, then steadied. Somewhere in the hallway, he swore he heard faint footsteps pacing slowly outside his door. The next morning, Alan found the historian's room door ajar. He knocked, called her name, no response. Inside, the room looked untouched except for one thing. On the bed lay a printed photograph. It showed the two of them in front of the ruins from the day before, except now, standing directly between them, was Eleanor, clearer than she had ever appeared before. Her eyes looked directly into the camera. Her veil hung tattered, but her smile was gentle, almost grateful. Alan felt his throat tighten as he noticed something else. The historian was no longer in the photograph. Her side of the image was an empty space, the outline of her body barely visible in faded light. His pulse raced. He grabbed the photo and turned it over. Written in faint pencil were 3 words, "Take one more." Alan ran out of the room, heart hammering, camera clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't stop running until he reached the old church on the edge of town, the place where Eleanor's funeral had taken place in 1874. The doors creaked open, revealing the same altar where the first photo of her had been taken over a century ago. The church was silent except for the low creak of its wooden beams and the soft flutter of moths against stained glass. Alan stepped carefully between the pews, his shoes echoing through the hollow space. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling through the light that filtered weakly from broken windows. He raised his camera, hesitant. The air felt charged, electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. As he aimed toward the altar, a sudden chill swept through him, and the temperature seemed to drop. His breath came out in faint white clouds. The altar was bare, but the faint outline of something, someone, shimmered faintly in the lens. He focused. The shape became clearer, a woman in a torn bridal dress, her veil drifting as though underwater. She wasn't moving, yet her eyes, pale, wide, shimmering like glass, seemed to follow him. Alan lowered the camera, but the figure remained. Her presence didn't vanish with the lens. Instead, she stepped forward, quiet, deliberate, the soft sound of fabric brushing the floor filling the silence. The camera in Alan's hand began to tremble violently, the screen flickering between the live image and static. When he looked through the viewfinder again, the church was no longer empty. It was filled with people, shadowy outlines of guests in Victorian clothing, seated silently in the pews. Candles burned along the aisle. The air smelled faintly of roses and burnt wax. And at the front, standing beside the ghostly bride, was a man in a black suit, his head lowered, expression unreadable. Alan realized what he was seeing, the original wedding. The one that had never happened. The one that ended in death. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. The bride turned toward him now, lifting her veil. Her face was serene, almost human, except for her eyes. They were empty, depthless, reflecting him back in infinite miniature. A whisper broke the silence, a woman's voice, calm and clear. "You took my place." The pews creaked as every figure turned its head toward him in unison. His hands shook as he pressed the shutter one last time, the flash illuminating the church for a brief second. When it faded, the figures were gone. Only the echo of footsteps and the faint scent of roses remained. Alan stared at his camera. On the preview screen was the photograph, but this time, he was not alone. He stood beside the bride, smiling faintly, veil reflected over both their faces. Alan returned home long after midnight, the road stretching endlessly beneath a violet sky. The old camera lay on the seat beside him, its lens faintly fogged as if it had been breathing. He didn't look at it. He couldn't. The image he'd taken at the church burned in his mind, his own reflection beside a bride who shouldn't exist. By the time he reached his cabin, the night was unnervingly still. Even the crickets had stopped singing. He locked the door, drew the curtains, and finally powered on his laptop. His hands trembled as he inserted the camera's card. When the files loaded, every photograph before that night was intact. Ordinary, empty, lifeless. But the last one, the church photo, glitched and flickered like a living pulse. For a moment, it was normal, him standing alone near the altar. Then, just as he exhaled, a faint shimmer appeared at his side. The bride. Her veil moved, though no wind existed within the image. Alan leaned closer, disbelief hardening into terror. The longer he stared, the more the photograph changed, grain deepening, light bending, until her hand lifted ever so slightly, the fingers curling in his direction. The photo wasn't just a record, it was responding to him. He scrambled back from the screen, heart hammering. The photo's background, the church walls, were darkening, bleeding into shadow. His reflection in the monitor looked paler, older, like something was draining color from his skin. Then the whisper returned, faint at first, but growing clearer, as though it came from behind the glass. "You took my place." The laptop's speakers crackled. The photo brightened suddenly, the bride's eyes turning toward him, this time, unmistakably alive. Alan slammed the laptop shut, his pulse racing, sweat beading along his temples. The silence that followed was unbearable. He turned to the camera on his desk. The lens was fogged again, but inside it, faint and circular, was her face. Not just a reflection, not a trick of light. Her expression was patient, as though waiting. Alan backed away, tripping over a chair. The entire cabin seemed to exhale, a long, low groan of wood expanding in cold air. He realized something then, something worse than fear. The haunting wasn't in the photo. It was in the act of being seen. For the next 2 nights, Alan couldn't bring himself to sleep. The photograph haunted every shadow of his small cabin. He had placed his laptop in a drawer, locked it, and told himself he would never open that file again. But as the hours dragged on, something gnawed at his mind, a pull, like gravity. By the 3rd night, he couldn't resist. He unlocked the drawer, powered on the laptop, and opened the image. At first, nothing seemed different. The same dim church, the same frozen bride. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something new. Behind her, near the far pews, there was a figure. Faint, out of focus. It looked like his neighbor, the one who had helped him move in weeks ago. He blinked, leaned closer. The figure was gone. A trick of light, perhaps. Yet when he looked again, the man's face was closer, now visible beside the bride's veil. Alan's stomach turned. He hadn't taken another photograph. No one could have altered the image. Still, the man was there, his expression blank, lifeless, as though he, too, had been pulled into whatever realm existed behind the picture's surface. Alan shut the laptop and sat in darkness, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. By dawn, he could no longer pretend. Every night, the photo changed. He began checking it compulsively, each time noticing another detail. A shadow that hadn't been there before, a candle lit where it had once been extinguished, faces appearing faintly along the church walls. On the fifth night, Alan saw something that stopped his breath entirely. In the far corner of the photo stood a small boy, pale, expressionless, the same boy who had drowned in the nearby creek years ago, according to local rumor. The boy's head tilted slightly toward the camera, his eyes as vacant as the bride's. Alan's body locked in terror. He wasn't just looking at a haunted photo anymore. The image was growing, feeding on faces, memories, and death itself. Each time he viewed it, something from reality bled into it. He unplugged the laptop, desperate to stop whatever this was, but as he turned away, he saw his own reflection in the darkened window. Behind him, faint and impossible, stood the bride, veil lifting, eyes fixed on him, and beside her the boy. Alan decided that night that the photograph had to be destroyed. He carried the laptop outside, into the biting chill of the forest that bordered his cabin. Moonlight bled through the trees, casting long shadows that twisted like living things. He dropped the laptop onto a stump, grabbed his axe, and brought it down with all his strength. The screen cracked, glass spraying like ice. For a moment, he felt relief, a childish sense of triumph. But then, faintly, the display flickered back to life. Despite the shattered glass, the image was still there, dim, distorted, but alive. The bride stood in the same pose, though her head had tilted slightly more toward the camera. The boy now stood closer too, his hand reaching for her gown. Alan's breath came in short bursts. He hit the screen again, and again, until the metal warped and the glow finally died. But even as the device lay in ruins, a thin, distant sound rose from it. Something between a sigh and a whisper, impossible yet unmistakable. It said his name, just once, and then the forest fell silent. Alan left the pieces there, burying them under a mound of leaves, and staggered back inside, trembling. The next morning, he woke to the smell of burning. In the middle of his kitchen table sat the same photograph, printed, unburned, untouched. The edges were yellowed, like it had aged 100 years overnight. Alan's mind broke in waves of panic. He tore it apart, scattering the pieces in the fireplace and lighting a match. But as the flames consumed the paper, the bride's eyes glimmered in the curling ash. For an instant, it looked like she blinked. Alan screamed and threw a blanket over the fire. Smoke filled the cabin, dense and choking, and when it cleared, the photo was gone. Not burned, gone. In its place was only a faint ring of soot, perfectly circular, like an imprint. Alan stumbled backward, coughing, as a faint knock came from his front door. Once, twice. He froze. The door creaked open on its own, and cold air slipped in. Standing on the threshold was the bride, her veil tattered, her lips curved into a ghost of a smile. Alan couldn't move. Every muscle in his body was locked as the figure in the doorway stared at him. The bride's face was pale, her skin like aged porcelain cracked beneath the surface. Her eyes were hollow yet glimmering, holding the same sadness he'd seen in the photograph. But now there was something else. Recognition. She stepped forward, each movement slow, deliberate. Her feet made no sound on the wooden floor. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered, her voice trembling like wind through dry leaves. Alan staggered backward, tripping over a chair. "What do you want?" he managed to choke out. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand, revealing a thin silver locket. Inside was a tiny portrait of her, and beside her in the picture was a man who looked exactly like Alan. The air drained from his lungs. "That's impossible," he whispered. The bride's lips moved soundlessly at first, then formed the words, "You promised me." Her eyes filled with tears, not human tears, but dark, tar-like drops that streaked her face. Alan's hands shook as fragmented memories flickered in his mind, not his own, yet vividly real. He saw a church, Candlelight. Vows exchanged beneath a cross. He saw her, alive, smiling, and himself in an era long vanished. Alan gasped and stumbled backward, clutching his head as pain tore through his skull. The memories came faster, flashes of 1874, a farmhouse wedding, laughter, and then fire. He saw himself, or the man who looked like him, standing over the bride's charred remains, his face twisted in guilt and horror. The same silver locket glinted in his hand. The truth hit him like a blade. This was not just a haunting, it was a reclamation. The bride hadn't come for revenge. She had come to finish a vow that death had stolen. Alan looked at her again, and for the first time, her expression softened. "You left me there," she whispered. "Now, we can finally be together." Her fingers brushed his face, and though cold as marble, he felt warmth beneath it. Ancient, sorrowful, almost loving. But as her hand lingered, the world around him began to dim. The cabin's light flickered, the air thickened, and the photographs pinned to his walls began to curl and blacken. Alan could feel himself being pulled into something, into her world, the world behind the glass. His heartbeat slowed as the veil between them dissolved. The world around Alan wavered like a reflection in rippling water. The bride's hand was still against his cheek, but her touch no longer felt cold. Instead, it pulsed, a heartbeat in reverse, each beat pulling warmth out of him and into her. "Do you see it now?" she murmured, her voice layered with echoes, as if two people spoke through her at once, her living self and her spectral form. Alan's eyes darted around the room, desperate to anchor himself to something real, but the cabin walls were melting into sepia hues, the same color as the photographs that lined them. He turned toward the nearest frame and froze. In the photograph, the bride was no longer alone. There were two figures standing side by side, the same bride in white, and next to her, Alan himself, eyes dull and lifeless. He stumbled backward, but there was no floor beneath him anymore, only the swirling blur of an image developing in reverse. He could hear the hiss of photographic plates, the distant creak of a camera shutter opening somewhere behind him. "It's almost time," she said, smiling faintly. "They'll remember us this way." Alan felt himself being pulled forward, his vision narrowing until all that remained was the image in front of him, the photograph slowly crystallizing into clarity. The sepia tones deepened, the frame solidified, the air grew sharp and metallic, like the tang of developing fluid. He tried to scream, but his voice made no sound. The bride stepped beside him, resting her hand in his. "Smile," she whispered. A blinding flash consumed everything. When the light faded, the room was empty. The camera, an old box model from the late 1800s, sat alone on the table, its lens pointed toward a wall where a single fresh photograph now hung. In it stood a bride and groom, both perfectly still, their faces serene. Dust settled slowly over the frame as if decades passed in a breath. Outside, the forest rustled, unaware of the new memory sealed forever behind glass. And somewhere, faintly, beneath the hum of time itself, came the echo of a whisper, "Till death do us part." Decades passed before anyone set foot in the decaying cabin again. The forest had swallowed it whole, ivy curling through its window frames, moss growing thick across the door. In 1912, a land surveyor named Thomas Doran stumbled upon the structure while mapping old properties. He pushed through the brittle doorway, his lantern's light revealing dust dancing like ash. The air was stale, unmoved for years. On a warped table sat a single object beneath a layer of grime, a framed photograph. Thomas wiped it clean with his sleeve, and the image beneath came into focus, a young bride and groom, frozen in sepia, staring outward with a stillness too perfect. For reasons he couldn't explain, Thomas felt an unease crawl up his spine. The bride's veil seemed almost translucent, as if caught mid-motion, while the groom's eyes reflected the faint glint of his lantern. He thought it was simply the old photographic glaze. Still, the longer he stared, the more convinced he became that their eyes were not just reflecting light, they were following it. Uneasy, Thomas set the frame down, but it tilted on its own, clicking softly against the wood as if something inside it shifted. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the silence. He leaned closer and noticed something strange. Faint streaks on the inside of the glass, like fingerprints pressed from within. A shiver ran through him. He packed the photograph carefully into his satchel, intending to deliver it to the local historical society in town. But as he left the cabin, he could have sworn he heard faint footsteps following him, perfectly in rhythm with his own. That night, while cataloging the find, Thomas placed the photograph on his desk under lamplight. He blinked, staring at the faces again. The bride's faint smile seemed wider now, her lips slightly parted. Her eyes glimmered with something not quite light, not quite life. And in the darkness behind her veil, the faintest impression of a second hand rested on her shoulder, a hand that hadn't been there before. That night, Thomas Doran awoke to the sound of glass cracking. The noise was sharp, sudden, like the snapping of ice. He shot upright in bed, his eyes adjusting to the dim orange glow from his oil lamp. The photograph was still on his desk, resting beneath the flickering light. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then he saw it. A thin fracture had split the glass from corner to corner, running directly across the bride's face. He leaned closer, noticing that behind the broken pane, the image seemed different again. The bride's expression wasn't just smiling anymore. It was alive with something darker, almost triumphant. Her pupils, once faintly gray, now looked deeper, more defined. Thomas blinked, rubbed his eyes, even adjusted the lamp, but the change remained. Then came the sound again, the faintest whisper of fabric, like a wedding dress brushing the floorboards. His breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the sound, and there, at the corner of the room, the shadows gathered thicker than before, moving, breathing, as if forming the outline of someone standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. Thomas stood frozen, the air cold enough to sting his lungs. The outline didn't move closer, but something within it shimmered faintly, a pale glint, like light through lace. Then the lamp flickered violently and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Thomas scrambled for matches, his trembling hands fumbling against the table. When he struck one, the sudden flare illuminated the photograph again. Only now, the crack had widened, and from within it, a thin, dark stain had begun to spread outward, curling like ink across the glass. Heart hammering, Thomas backed away. He could smell something faint and wrong, old perfume mixed with damp earth. Then, from the shadowed corner, a low whisper drifted through the silence. It wasn't distinct at first, just the rhythm of breath forming words. But as the flame wavered, he heard it clearly. "Till death do us part." The match burned his fingers, and when he dropped it, the room was dark again. Morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, painting the room in a gray wash. Thomas had not slept. He sat in the chair facing the photograph, now veiled beneath a cloth. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the bride, standing in the dark, whispering her vow. It wasn't just a dream. The air had truly turned cold, and his breath had fogged the mirror beside the bed. He knew what he had to do. The next day, Thomas returned to the village, determined to uncover the bride's story. At the local records office, a clerk led him to a dusty ledger of death certificates. There it was, Eleanor Whitcomb, age 22, deceased on the day of her wedding, 1874. Cause of death, unknown. But a margin note added a chilling detail. No signs of struggle, eyes open, smile intact. His heart pounded as he traced the ink with his finger. According to local gossip, Eleanor had collapsed at the altar moments before she could say her vows. Her groom, Richard Harrow, had vanished that same evening. Some said into the woods. Others claimed he drowned himself in the marsh behind their home. The legend went silent after that. Thomas decided to visit the old Whitcomb estate, long abandoned and swallowed by creeping vines. The structure loomed like a skeleton against the gray sky. Inside, time had rotted the wood and stripped the walls bare, but the faint scent of rose water lingered in the air, the same sickly sweet note he had smelled the night before. In the parlor, amid dust and decay, hung another photograph, larger and framed in tarnished silver. It was the same wedding image, Eleanor in her gown, smiling gently beside a figure who now appeared completely faded. Only her was clear, as if time refused to erase her presence. Thomas lifted the photograph carefully, and a folded piece of paper fell from behind the frame. It was a letter written in elegant, looping handwriting. He promised we'd never part, and now he hides from the vow. But I remain, waiting for the next to take his place. Thomas stared, horrified. The words seemed addressed not to her missing groom, but to him. The paper smelled faintly of old roses, and when he looked up, the air shimmered, and the faint outline of a veil drifted past the window. Night fell hard and fast over the Whitcomb estate. The last light of day stretched long and crimson across the floorboards, cutting through the broken windows like bloodied ribbons. Thomas sat alone in the parlor, the photograph of Eleanor before him on the mantel. The letter trembled in his hand, the ink now smudged by sweat and fear. He tried to convince himself it was superstition, a ghost story spun by villagers, but deep inside, he knew something was watching. The shadows in the corners seemed alive, shifting when he didn't look directly at them. From upstairs came a faint rustle, like the drag of silk across wood. Then, unmistakably, the sound of footsteps. He stood, heart pounding, calling out softly, "Is someone there?" No answer, only the creak of the old staircase. When he turned back, toward the mantel, the photograph had changed. Eleanor's head was slightly tilted now, her once gentle smile stretching wider, unnatural, wrong. A faint shimmer of moisture glistened in her painted eyes, as if tears of joy, or hunger, had welled. The air around him dropped to freezing, and his breath came out in pale white streams. Somewhere, a woman's whisper coiled through the air, "You came for me." Thomas backed away slowly, but his foot caught on a loose floorboard. He fell backward, the candle toppling beside him, its flames spilling like a liquid star onto the old, dry rug. Smoke bloomed instantly. He scrambled to his feet, coughing, trying to reach the front door. But the air seemed to thicken, as though the house itself resisted his escape. In the flicker of the growing fire, the photograph glowed, Eleanor's face alive with a terrible serenity, her eyes following him. The veil in the picture fluttered, though there was no wind. Then, through the crackling heat and smoke, she appeared, translucent but solid enough that her footsteps echoed on the boards. Her lips moved, forming silent words that matched the letter's vow. "I remain, waiting for the next," he screamed as her hand reached toward him, cold, pale, and endless, before everything vanished into light. The next morning, the villagers found the house burned to its frame. No trace of Thomas's body was ever found, but the photograph, untouched by flame, sat in the ashes of the parlor, Eleanor's face now turned directly toward the viewer, smiling, content.